I'm Emma, 32, and every Thanksgiving I'd return to my parents' house in Cedar Grove like clockwork. This year felt different from the moment I walked through the door. My sister Rachel was practically glowing as she carved the turkey, and I knew something big was coming. "I have news," Rachel announced, her engagement ring catching the dining room light. "Mark and I just put an offer on that gorgeous Victorian on Elm Street. You know, the one with the wraparound porch?" The table erupted in congratulations. My parents beamed like she'd just announced a cure for cancer. Then Rachel turned to me with that look, part pity, part curiosity, all judgment. "What about you, Em? Any thoughts about settling down? You can't live in that tiny apartment forever." 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. The silence stretched like taffy while I sat there, the successful but perpetually single daughter, once again under the family microscope. Let me paint you a picture of my family dynamics. My parents, David and Linda, built their lives around traditional milestones. Dad worked the same accounting job for 30 years. Mom devoted herself to creating the perfect home. They measure success in mortgages, marriage certificates, and grandchildren. Rachel followed their blueprint perfectly: college sweetheart, engagement at 24, wedding at 26, part-time job that wouldn't interfere with future family plans. She's not malicious about being the golden child, but there's always been an unspoken scoreboard in our house, and she's winning by every metric they understand. Then there's me.
I chose differently.
After college, I moved to Portland and worked my way up through 3 marketing agencies. Now I'm creative director at a tech startup developing educational apps for kids with learning disabilities. I live in a converted loft downtown with exposed brick and city views. I travel for work and pleasure. I date when I meet someone interesting, but I've never felt the need to force a relationship just to check a box. My family has never understood why I'd choose corporate stress over real happiness. They don't see that I'm building something meaningful. They only see what I'm missing. The question started small years ago. Meet anyone special? Became, your biological clock is ticking. Became, don't you want someone to take care of you? Every holiday gathering turned into an intervention about my lifestyle choices. 2 Christmases ago, my aunt asked when I'd give my parents grandchildren. When I mentioned that wasn't necessarily in my plans, you'd think I'd announced plans to burn down an orphanage. My mother actually cried. Last Easter, my father cornered me about my financial security without a partner, as if my 6-figure salary and investment portfolio were just play money until a man came along to manage my life properly. Through it all, Rachel maintained her position as the daughter who got it right. Her concerned comments about my loneliness stung worse than direct criticism. There was always the subtext that I was somehow broken, incomplete, missing the point of life entirely. So when Rachel asked about settling down across the Thanksgiving table, it wasn't an innocent question. It was the latest salvo in a years-long campaign to convince me that my choices were wrong. I arrived at my parents' house that afternoon carrying homemade butterscotch pie and my usual pre-holiday anxiety. The familiar sense of sage and turkey filled the air, along with Christmas music. Mom always started the holiday playlist early. Everything looked exactly the same as my childhood. Family photos covering every surface, the good china set for 6, Dad's recliner positioned for optimal TV viewing. "There's our city girl," Mom said, embracing me in her signature lavender perfume. "How's the big promotion treating you?" Before I could answer, Dad appeared. "Still working those crazy hours? There's more to life than climbing the corporate ladder, you know." 5 minutes. It took exactly 5 minutes for the first dig at my choices. Rachel and Mark arrived shortly after, carrying a bottle of champagne and news about their house hunt. Rachel looked radiant in her cream sweater, blonde hair perfectly styled, the picture of domestic bliss. Mark, pleasant but forgettable, worked in finance and said things like blessed unironically. During appetizers, Mom spread photo albums across the coffee table, a tradition designed to prompt nostalgia and, increasingly, remind me of simpler times when we were all under one roof. "Look at baby Emma and her graduation cap," Rachel cooed. "You were so ambitious even then." The word ambitious hung in the air like an accusation. Dinner conversation flowed predictably. Updates on extended family, Dad's retirement plans, Mom's book club. I shared news about my latest project, an app helping dyslexic children improve reading comprehension, but I could see eyes glazing over when I mentioned user engagement metrics. Then Rachel dropped her bombshell about the house, and the spotlight swung to her upcoming domestic paradise. For bedrooms, updated kitchen, perfect for the next phase of their lives. The meaningful glances between her and Mark made their family planning timeline crystal clear. It's such a relief to be putting down real roots, Rachel continued. No more renting, no more temporary solutions. We're building something permanent. She turned to me with that smile. What about you, Em? Any thoughts about settling down? You can't live in that tiny apartment forever. And there it was, the question that reduced my carefully constructed life to a problem requiring their solution. The table fell silent. Everyone waited for my response, probably expecting the usual deflection about being too busy with work right now, or haven't met the right person yet. Instead, something inside me snapped. You know what? I said, my voice eerily calm. I am settled down. I'm settled into a career that challenges me and makes a real difference. I'm settled into financial independence that means I'll never need anyone else for security. I'm settled into a life that fulfills me exactly as it is. The silence that followed was deafening. For years, I've sat at this table listening to comments about my empty apartment, my temporary lifestyle, my choices being somehow less valid than the traditional path. But there's an assumption here that there's only one definition of success, only one path to happiness. I looked directly at Rachel. I'm genuinely happy for you and Mark. Your house sounds perfect for the life you want. But when you ask when I'm going to settle down, there's judgment in that question, an implication that I'm somehow unsettled, unstable, or incomplete. My voice grew stronger. Do you want to know what settling down looks like for me? It's the career I built from nothing. It's the financial independence I earned. It's the work that helps children overcome learning challenges. Last month, a mother thanked me because our app helped her son read his first full book. That's my version of making a difference. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Dad's jaw clenched. Rachel looked genuinely shocked. I love you all, I continued, but I need you to understand that my version of settling down looks different from yours. And that's okay. I'm not asking you to choose my path. I'm asking you to respect that it's mine to choose. The aftermath was predictably uncomfortable. Mom cried. Dad lectured about biological realities. Rachel accused me of turning a simple question into a feminist manifesto. But something had shifted. For the first time, I'd spoken my truth instead of swallowing their disappointment. I excused myself and drove to Riverside Park, where Rachel and I had played as kids. Sitting on the old wooden bench overlooking the pond, I felt both completely alone and strangely liberated. My phone buzzed, a text from my colleague Sarah. Hope the family inquisition isn't too brutal. By the way, the Henderson account wants to double their contract. Your pitch was brilliant. Drinks when you're back. A reminder of the world I'd built for myself, where my worth wasn't measured in wedding rings and mortgage payments. I returned to the house an hour later to find my family exactly where I'd left them, tense and waiting. This time, though, the conversation was different. Still difficult, but honest in a way we'd never managed before. I'm sorry for leaving, I said, but I needed space to collect my thoughts. I stand by what I said about how I've been feeling. Over the next hour, we talked more openly than we had in years. I explained how their constant questions felt like judgment. They admitted their comments came from concern, not malice. Rachel confessed she sometimes envied my independence even while pitying my singleness. It wasn't a complete resolution. Old patterns don't disappear overnight. But it was a beginning. The real breakthrough came when I shared something I'd been keeping secret. I was buying a building. An old textile factory downtown that I was converting into affordable workspace for women entrepreneurs, particularly mothers returning to the workforce. You're buying a building? Dad asked, his accountant brain immediately calculating figures. With investors, yes. It's my version of putting down roots, different from buying a house in the suburbs, but no less permanent or meaningful. For the first time, they listened to my professional life without changing the subject. Dad offered advice on property insurance. Mom asked thoughtful questions about the women who would benefit. Rachel seemed genuinely interested in the architectural restoration. The evening ended with tentative understanding. They would try to see my choices as valid rather than lacking. I would try to share more of my world rather than withdrawing defensively. 1 month later, my family visited my Portland loft for the first time in 3 years. Mom marveled at my city views. Dad approved of my building security. Rachel admitted my minimalist aesthetic suited my lifestyle perfectly. But the real turning point came when we toured the textile building project. Walking through the construction zone, explaining my vision for the business incubator, the childcare center, the programs for first-time entrepreneurs, I watched my family's expressions shift from polite interest to genuine respect. "This is incredible," Rachel said quietly. "You're going to help so many people." That Christmas, the family dynamic had fundamentally changed. Not perfect. Old habits die hard, but authentic in a way it hadn't been for years. They asked about my work with real curiosity. I shared updates about the building renovation. Rachel invited me to see her new house without the previous undertone of superiority. The lesson I learned was profound. True happiness comes not from conforming to others' expectations, but from living in alignment with your own values. Success has many definitions, none inherently more valid than others. 6 months later, the Heritage Building, my renovated textile factory, opened its doors. My entire family attended the ribbon cutting, standing proudly as I spoke about creating opportunities for women to define success on their own terms. Afterward, a young mother approached to thank me. "This space changed everything for my daughter and me," she said. "I couldn't find affordable childcare and workspace anywhere else." That evening, watching the sunset from the building's rooftop garden, surrounded by family who finally saw and respected my choices, I found peace with my path. I had settled down years ago, not into a house or marriage, but into myself, my values, my authentic way of being in the world. The judgments of others, even those I loved, could no longer shake that foundation. My story isn't about choosing career over family or independence over partnership. It's about the freedom to define success on your own terms, to build a life that reflects your values rather than others' expectations. Have you ever had to defend your life choices to family? Remember, your path is valid, your choices matter, and settling down has nothing to do with other people's definitions of happiness. Sometimes the most radical act is simply being authentically yourself. The months following that transformative Christmas brought unexpected developments. My relationship with Rachel deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. She started calling me weekly, not with updates about mortgage rates and paint colors, but with genuine questions about business strategy and career development. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me during one of our Tuesday evening calls, "about exploring other dimensions of myself. Mark and I are settled in the house now, and I have this energy I don't know what to do with." It turned out Rachel had been harboring her own secret ambitions. She'd always been talented at interior design, with an eye for space and color that had impressed everyone who visited her homes over the years. But she'd never considered it more than a hobby, something that came naturally but wasn't practical for a wife planning a family. "What if it could be both?" I suggested. "What if you started small, maybe helping friends with their spaces, building a portfolio?" The idea terrified and excited her in equal measure. Within 3 months, she had her first paying client, a colleague who'd seen photos of her new house and begged for help with her own renovation. Word spread quickly through her social network, and soon Rachel was booking consultations weeks in advance. "I never realized how much I missed using my brain this way," she confessed during one of my visits to Cedar Grove. We were sitting in her kitchen, laptops open, as she showed me her business plan, a surprisingly sophisticated document outlining her services, pricing structure, and growth projections. "You always had this in you," I told her. "You just needed permission to explore it." She looked up from her computer. "Is that what you felt like for all those years? Like you needed permission to be who you were?" The question caught me off guard with its insight. Yes, exactly. But the permission I was waiting for was never going to come from anyone else. I had to give it to myself. Our parents' reaction to Rachel's business venture was fascinating to observe. The same people who had spent years questioning my career focus now worried that Rachel was taking on too much alongside her domestic responsibilities. The double standard was glaring, but Rachel handled it with grace I admired. "It's just a few hours a week," she assured them, though I knew she was working closer to 20 hours on client projects. And Mark is completely supportive. Mark was indeed supportive, proud even, bragging about his wife's decorating business to their friends. He didn't fully understand the scope of what Rachel was building, but he recognized her happiness and energy in a way that mattered. Meanwhile, my own life was evolving in unexpected directions. The Heritage Building had become everything I'd hoped, a thriving community of women entrepreneurs, a place where business plans were refined over shared lunches and childcare was built into the ecosystem. But success brought new challenges and opportunities one hadn't anticipated. "Emma, you need to see this," said Maria Santos, one of our first tenants, bursting into my office on a rainy Thursday morning. Maria had started a sustainable clothing line for professional women, and her energy was typically magnetic, but this was different. "What's got you so excited?" I asked, looking up from my quarterly budget review. She thrust her laptop toward me, showing a local news website. The headline read, "Portland's Heritage Building, a model for female entrepreneurship." The article featured photos of our space, interviews with several tenants, and a lengthy quote from me about creating opportunities for women who might otherwise be overlooked. "This is amazing," I said, scrolling through the piece. "The exposure will help all of us." But Maria wasn't finished. "That's not the best part. Look at this email I got this morning." She pulled up a message from a venture capital firm in Seattle. They'd read the article and wanted to discuss potential investment opportunities with Heritage Building tenants. Moreover, they were interested in the building model itself. Could it be replicated in other cities? The idea of expansion had never seriously crossed my mind. The Heritage Building was deeply personal, rooted in my own experiences and Portland's specific community needs. But as Maria and I discussed the possibilities, I began to see the broader potential. Over the following weeks, I found myself in conversations I'd never imagined. At conference calls with investors, meetings with city planners in Seattle and San Francisco, consultations with architects about adaptive reuse of historic buildings. The work was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "You're glowing," Rachel observed during my next visit home. "I haven't seen you this excited about anything since you told us about the original building project." We were walking through downtown Cedar Grove, something we'd rarely done as adults. Main Street had been revitalized since our childhood, with new cafes and boutiques occupying storefronts that had sat empty for years. "It feels like everything I've learned is coming together in ways I didn't expect," I admitted. "But it's also overwhelming. If we expand to other cities, I need to travel constantly, at least for the first few years. It's not exactly the settled lifestyle Mom and Dad finally started accepting." Rachel stopped walking and turned to face me. "Emma, you know that's not what settling down means anymore, right? At least not for our family. You taught us that." Her words carried weight I hadn't expected. The scared, defensive person who'd exploded at Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier had been replaced by someone more confident, more secure in her choices. But I realized I was still fighting some of those old battles internally. "I guess I'm worried about falling back into old patterns," I said. "The family thinking I'm choosing work over stability again." "Let me tell you what I see," Rachel said, resuming our walk. "I see someone who built something meaningful from nothing, proved it works, and now has the opportunity to help hundreds more women do the same thing. How is that anything other than exactly what you were meant to do?" The expansion project moved forward faster than I'd anticipated. By spring, we'd secured funding for heritage buildings in Seattle and San Francisco, with tentative plans for Denver and Austin. I hired a small team to help manage the development process, including Sarah from my old marketing agency, who jumped at the chance to work on something with such clear social impact. The travel was indeed intense. Weeks spent in different cities, working with local partners to identify suitable buildings, understand community needs, navigate zoning requirements. It was exactly the kind of schedule that had prompted years of family concern about my work-life balance. But something had shifted in how I approached both work and family. Instead of compartmentalizing my life, I began integrating them in new ways. When I had meetings in Seattle, I invited Mom to join me for the weekend, showing her the Pike Place Market and the building we were renovating in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. When San Francisco negotiations stretched longer than expected, Dad flew out to provide his accounting expertise on the financial projections. "I never understood what you did before," he admitted as we walked through the cavernous space that would become Heritage San Francisco. "But seeing this, talking to the women who'll benefit from it, it makes sense now. You're not just working. You're building something that will outlast all of us." His words meant more than any performance review or investor approval ever could. For the first time in my adult life, my father saw my work as I saw it, not as a substitute for traditional success, but as success itself, meaningful and lasting. The most unexpected development came during the Denver site visit. I was touring a former furniture factory with the local development team when I noticed another group examining the same building. Their leader was tall, dark-haired, and intensely focused as he discussed structural modifications with his architect. "Excuse me," I approached during their break. "Are you looking at this space too? We might be competing for the same property." He turned with a smile that was both professional and genuinely warm. "David Chen, Chen's Sustainable Development. And you're Emma Morrison from Heritage Buildings. I've been following your work. It's impressive." As it turned out, we weren't competing. David's company specialized in green retrofits of historic buildings, and he'd been hoping to connect with organizations doing meaningful community work. Our goals aligned perfectly. "What if we partnered?" he suggested over coffee later that afternoon. "Your programming expertise and my sustainable building knowledge could create something really special." The partnership made sense professionally, but I found myself looking forward to our planning meetings for reasons that had nothing to do with LEED certification and energy efficiency. David was smart, passionate about his work, and refreshingly uncomplicated. He asked about my life in Portland with genuine interest, shared stories about his own journey from corporate architecture to sustainable development, and never once made me feel like my professional focus was something that needed explaining or defending. "You know," he said during one of our evening planning sessions, "I've never met someone who talked about their work the way you do. Like, it's not separate from who you are, but an expression of it." The observation was perceptive in a way that caught me off guard. Most people saw my career intensity as either admirable or concerning, but rarely as authentic self-expression. I spent a lot of years feeling like I had to choose between professional fulfillment and personal relationships, I admitted. "I'm still figuring out how to integrate them." "Maybe the right person wouldn't require you to choose," he suggested quietly. The conversation stayed with me through the following weeks as our professional collaboration deepened into something more personal. David respected my travel schedule, understood the demands of building something meaningful, and never suggested that my commitments were obstacles to overcome rather than integral parts of who I was. When I brought him to Cedar Grove for Rachel's housewarming party, her interior design business had grown enough to justify a dedicated home office space. My family's reaction was subtly different from their responses to previous boyfriends. "Tell me about the sustainability aspects of the heritage buildings," Mom asked David over dinner, genuinely curious about the technical details rather than just making polite conversation. Dad engaged him in a lengthy discussion about the economics of historic preservation, clearly impressed by David's knowledge of tax incentives and community development funding. But it was Rachel's response that surprised me most. After David had stepped outside to take a business call, she pulled me aside in the kitchen. "He gets it," she said simply. "Gets what?" "That your work isn't something you do, it's who you are. And he's not trying to change that or manage around it. He's genuinely interested in it." She was right. David wasn't dating me despite my professional intensity. He was attracted to it, energized by it, inspired to bring his own best work to our collaboration. The Denver Heritage Building opened 18 months later, our most ambitious project yet. The opening ceremony brought together local entrepreneurs, city officials, and women from the Portland and Seattle locations. As I spoke about creating spaces where women could define success on their own terms, I saw my parents in the audience, beaming with pride that was no longer complicated by confusion or concern. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and the featured entrepreneurs shared their stories, David found me on the building's rooftop garden. "Proud of what you've built," he said, gesturing toward the city lights spread below us. "We've built," I corrected. "The sustainability features are getting as much attention as the programming." He smiled. I was talking about more than just the buildings. The observation was accurate. Over the past 2 years, I'd built not just a successful social enterprise, but relationships that didn't require me to diminish myself. A partnership with David that enhanced rather than competed with my professional goals. A family dynamic based on mutual respect rather than resigned acceptance. Most importantly, I'd built confidence in my own choices that no longer needed external validation to sustain it. The heritage building model continued expanding: Austin, Phoenix, Boston, each location adapted to its community's specific needs while maintaining the core mission of supporting women entrepreneurs. David and I married 2 years later in the Portland Heritage Building's rooftop garden, surrounded by the community we'd helped create. Rachel, now running a successful interior design firm with 3 employees, served as my maid of honor. In her speech, she talked about watching me learn to advocate for my own happiness and how that example had given her permission to explore dimensions of herself she'd never allowed before. "Emma taught our family that there are many ways to build a meaningful life," she said, raising her glass. "And that the bravest thing you can do is insist on being authentically yourself, even when that makes other people uncomfortable." The evening felt like a celebration not just of David's and my partnership, but of all the relationships that had evolved to support authentic versions of ourselves rather than demanding performance of who we thought we should be. As the party wound down and David and I stood in the same spot where I'd once watched the sunset alone, overwhelmed by the scope of what we'd built, I thought about that Thanksgiving dinner when Rachel had asked when I would settle down. I had settled down, just not in the way anyone had expected. I'd settled into my values, my purpose, my authentic self. Everything else, the buildings, the relationships, the recognition had grown from that foundation. The question that had once felt like judgment had become prophecy. When would I settle down? I already had. The life I'd built was exactly where I belonged. 5 years after that pivotal Thanksgiving dinner, I found myself back in Cedar Grove for another family gathering, but this time the dynamics were completely transformed. Rachel was hosting Thanksgiving at her house for the first time, her dining room table extended to accommodate not just our family, but several of her interior design clients who had become close friends, and Maria Santos from the Heritage Building, who was in town visiting her own family. The conversation around the table reflected how much had changed. Instead of awkward questions about my personal life, people were asking about the Heritage Building model being featured in Harvard Business Review, about David's latest Sustainable Architecture Award, about Rachel's design firm landing a contract with a major hotel chain. "Emma, you have to tell everyone about the documentary," Mom said, serving her famous stuffing with visible pride. I felt myself blush slightly. "It's still in early production. Nothing definite yet." "What documentary?" asked one of Rachel's clients, a young mother who had started her own catering business. "Netflix is considering a documentary series about women entrepreneurs changing their communities," Rachel explained. "Emma and the Heritage Buildings are going to be featured prominently." The idea still felt surreal. When the documentary producer had first reached out, I'd assumed it was some kind of mistake. But after several months of interviews and filming, I was beginning to understand that what we'd built was being recognized as something larger than I'd originally envisioned. "The most interesting part," I said, "is how they're focusing on the ripple effects. They're interviewing women who started businesses in our buildings, but also their employees, their customers, the communities that have been impacted." "Like me," said Maria, raising her wine glass. "I never would have had the confidence to start my clothing line without the supportive environment Emma created. And now I employ 12 people full-time." The pride in her voice was matched by the expressions around the table. These weren't just professional accomplishments being celebrated. They were human stories of people finding courage to pursue their dreams. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee and Rachel's now famous apple tart, I found myself in conversation with her youngest client, a 26-year-old named Sophia who was starting a nonprofit focused on financial literacy for women. "I have to ask," Sophia said quietly, "how did you handle the family pressure when you were building your career?" "My parents keep asking when I'm going to get a real job instead of working 60-hour weeks for no salary." The question transported me back to my own struggles with family expectations. But looking around Rachel's warm, welcoming home, seeing my parents engaged in animated conversation with David about sustainable building materials, witnessing the genuine respect and interest they now showed for my work, I realized how profoundly our relationships had evolved. It took time, I told her honestly, and it required me to consistently advocate for my choices, even when it was uncomfortable. But the most important thing was staying true to what fulfilled me, regardless of external pressure. Rachel appeared beside us, carrying a tray of coffee cups. "Emma taught me something crucial," she said to Sophia. "She showed me that there's not just one way to live a meaningful life." Once I understood that, I had the courage to start my own business, even though it didn't fit the traditional timeline I'd planned. "What do you mean?" Sophia asked. Rachel set down the tray and settled into the chair across from us. "I always thought I had to choose between family and career, like they were mutually exclusive. Watching Emma proved that wasn't true. You can build a life that integrates all the things that matter to you. You just have to be willing to create a model that works for you rather than following someone else's blueprint." As if summoned by our conversation, Mom joined our little circle. "I owe you both an apology," she said, looking between Rachel and me. "For years, I was so focused on wanting you to be safe and secure that I couldn't see how limiting my definition of security was." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "When I was your age, women had fewer options. Marriage and motherhood were the primary paths to stability. It took me time to understand that you'd found different ways to create security and meaning." The vulnerability in her admission touched something deep in my chest. This wasn't the first time we discussed our past tensions, but hearing her acknowledge her own evolution was still moving. "What changed your mind?" Sophia asked, genuinely curious. Mom smiled. "Honestly, seeing the impact of Emma's work, meeting the women who've been helped by the heritage buildings, understanding the scope of what she's created. I realized that she hadn't rejected family values. She'd expanded them to include a larger community of people she was helping." The conversation was interrupted by David appearing with his phone. "Emma, you need to see this," he said, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. He showed me an email from the mayor of Portland. The city council had voted unanimously to recognize the heritage building model with their Community Impact Award. More significantly, they were proposing a partnership to help fund heritage buildings in 3 additional Portland neighborhoods. "This is incredible," I said, reading through the details. "This level of city support could help us reach so many more women." "What does this mean practically?" Rachel asked, looking over my shoulder at the email. "It means we could potentially triple our impact in Portland alone," David explained. "And it creates a template for other cities to partner with us rather than just hosting our buildings." As the evening continued, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The scared, defensive woman who had exploded at a family dinner 5 years earlier had been replaced by someone confident enough to dream bigger, to take meaningful risks, to build not just a career but a legacy. But perhaps more importantly, that journey had been shared with family members who had grown alongside me. Rachel's business success had given her a new understanding of professional ambition. My parents' involvement in my work had expanded their definition of meaningful contribution. Even David's integration into our family had happened naturally, without the awkwardness that had characterized my previous relationships. Later that evening, after the other guests had left and we were helping Rachel clean up, Dad pulled me aside. "I've been thinking about something," he said, drying dishes with characteristic methodical precision. "About that Thanksgiving when you got so upset with us." I tensed slightly, not sure where this was leading. "I was hurt at the time," he continued. "Thought you were being overdramatic, ungrateful even. But I understand now that you were fighting for something important, the right to be accepted for who you were, not who we thought you should be." He set down the dish towel and looked at me directly. "I'm proud of the woman you became, Emma. Not just your accomplishments, but your integrity. Your willingness to stay true to yourself even when it was difficult. The words I'd waited years to hear were finally being spoken, but they carried even more weight because they came from a place of genuine understanding rather than reluctant acceptance. "Thanks, Dad," I said, hugging him. "That means everything to me. And I'm proud of how you've handled success," he added. "You could have become bitter about our early lack of understanding, but instead you helped us grow. That takes real character." The conversation reminded me of something I'd learned through years of working with entrepreneurs at the heritage buildings. Success isn't just about achieving your goals, but about maintaining your values and relationships throughout the journey. As David and I drove back to our hotel that night, I found myself thinking about the documentary interviews I'd done. The producer had asked repeatedly about the cost of my choices, what I'd sacrificed to build my career, whether I regretted not following a more traditional path. At the time, I'd struggled to answer because the premise felt wrong. I hadn't sacrificed anything meaningful. I'd simply chosen to build a life that aligned with my values and abilities. The relationships that couldn't adapt to that choice weren't relationships I'd wanted to maintain anyway. But now, surrounded by family who genuinely supported my choices, married to a partner who enhanced rather than competed with my professional goals, connected to a community of women whose lives had been changed by work that fulfilled me deeply, I could see how incomplete those early interview answers had been. I hadn't just avoided sacrificing things I valued. I'd created a life richer than anything I could have imagined when I first chose my unconventional path. The next morning, Rachel and I took a walk through our old neighborhood before David and I drove back to Portland. The streets looked smaller than I remembered, but the sense of possibility felt larger. "I have something to tell you," Rachel said as we paused in front of our childhood home, now occupied by a young family with tricycles scattered across the front lawn. "What's that?" "Mark and I are going to start trying for a baby next year." I felt a flutter of something, not jealousy exactly, but a complex mix of emotions I needed a moment to process. "That's wonderful," I said and meant it. "You'll be an amazing mother." "The thing is," she continued, "I'm not planning to stop working. My business is too important to me now. I want to show my children that women can build meaningful careers and be present parents." The statement would have been revolutionary coming from the Rachel of 5 years ago, who had planned to reduce her career to part-time status as soon as children arrived. "How do you feel about that?" I asked. "Terrified and excited in equal measure," she admitted. "But I keep thinking about what you said at Thanksgiving all those years ago, about there being different ways to create meaning and security. I want my kids to see both parents pursuing work that matters to them." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Rachel spoke again. "You know what's funny? I used to think you were choosing career over family. Now I realize you were choosing to define family more broadly, to include all the people you help through your work, all the relationships you build through shared purpose." Her insight was profound in its simplicity. I hadn't rejected the value of family. I'd expanded my definition of it to include chosen family, professional family, community family. The heritage buildings weren't just workspaces. They were places where women created support networks that functioned like extended families. "Maybe that's what settling down really means," I said. "Not limiting yourself to conventional structures, but finding the combination of relationships and work and values that feels like home. And having the courage to keep adjusting that combination as you grow," Rachel added. As we headed back toward her house, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. The pain of that Thanksgiving confrontation had been necessary. It had forced all of us to examine our assumptions and grow beyond them. Now, instead of defending my choices, I was inspiring others to make brave choices of their own. Instead of feeling isolated by my differences, I was connected to communities that celebrated those differences. Instead of waiting for acceptance, I had created a life so fulfilling that external validation, while nice, was no longer necessary for my peace of mind. The documentary aired 8 months later to widespread acclaim. The heritage building model was featured in business schools, replicated in 12 additional cities, and resulted in a book deal I'd never sought. But the moment that meant the most to me was sitting in my parents' living room, watching the episode that featured our family's journey from conflict to understanding. On screen, Mom was saying, "I thought I knew what success looked like for my daughters. Emma taught me that success has many faces, and the most beautiful one is authenticity." Dad added, "She didn't just build a business, she built a movement. And she did it by staying true to herself even when we couldn't see the value in her choices." The camera then cut to Rachel in her design studio. "My sister showed me it was possible to create a life that honored all parts of yourself. I'm a better mother, wife, and entrepreneur because I learned that lesson." Watching my family speak about my journey with such pride and understanding, I finally felt the full circle completion of that difficult Thanksgiving dinner. The question, "When will you settle down?" had been answered not just with words, but with a life that demonstrated settling down's truest meaning, becoming fully, authentically, courageously yourself.